Hello again, everybody. I'm Chris Mooneyham, and welcome to the TCA All Sports Report. As always, brought to you by Fox 5 Atlanta, 680 The Fan, and of course, the Touchdown Club of Atlanta. This is the final week of April in 2015, or depending on when you're watching this, of course, maybe the first week of May. And of course, I bring that up for a reason because without question, the wildest month for championships and playoff action in the state of Georgia, high school athletics-wise, of course, is the month of May. This is the month that guys like me absolutely live for. I will cover five state championships, or I'll actually be on the microphone. I'll cover all of the state championships, of course, but I'll be on the play-by-play duties for 5 separate championship sports here in the month of May. So yeah, a little busy moving forward over the next few weeks. We'll talk about that in the What's Next portion of our program. We'll also dip into the history bag and talk about the very first ever TCA Player of the Year. And in the final segment of the program, we'll talk about some recruiting. One of the top overall athletes across the country who resides down in Savannah, well, his recruiting is now up for grabs. And yes, the Dogs have a very good shot. But first, in What's Happening, let's talk about our first official championship of the spring season. And of course, I'm talking about gymnastics. The GHSA Gymnastics State Championships were last week over at the Westminster Schools, right off of West Paces Ferry. Buford wins its second consecutive GHSA championship. This was a little different from last year. Many of you may remember that the Wolves got off to a slow start last year on the beam, as a matter of fact, and then about halfway through or in the second event, then rallied. By the time they got to the third event, they were taking over and really clinched the thing early in the fourth event. Well, there was no such drama this year. Buford wins their second consecutive title. Really, in, I think it's fair to say, convincing fashion. Final score, 111.425 to 107.725, nearly a 4-point differential. That's a pretty substantial margin. It finishes Buford, Carrollton, Lambert, Forsyth Central, and Colquitt County. Colquitt County, the only team in the 6A classification to get into the top 5. A very interesting top 5 when you think about classifications. Again, it finishes Buford, Carrollton, and Lambert, your top 3, and then Forsyth Central and Colquitt County rounding out your top 5. Lindsey Jones posts a state championship winning mark of 9.7 early on in the competition, again on the beam, and gave Buford a lead that they would not relinquish. The Wolves' Logan Nugent and teammate Berkeley Barrett crowded the podium on the bar, as the AJC liked to say, with first and second place finishes. All-around results, very interesting. We want to touch on each form of the event. All-around results, Kelly Aycock from Locust Grove, the individual winner there. The beam results, Lindsey Jones, as I mentioned, from Buford, she the individual champion. Logan Nugent on the bar was the individual winner, 9.55, her score there. Lindsey Jones wins the floor at 9.55, and the vault result goes to a young lady from Carrollton, Kendall Yett. Kendall Yett wins on the vault. So, another championship for Buford. Lambert not able to catch them. Carrollton ends up second. A lot of people thought it was going to be Buford or Lambert for the championship. The Lady Wolves win their second consecutive, and they have some youth, by the way, so this might not be the end of their run. Okay, coming up next, I mentioned it in the opener, the very first TCA Player of the Year. The Touchdown Club of Atlanta was founded in 1938. A lot of people forget that. And it was founded by a group of football fans who were looking to promote the game of football in Atlanta. This group would get together each Monday in the fall of 1938 and talk about the games that occurred over the weekend. It was at one of these meetings in November, early November of 1939, that the group decided to award an outstanding college football player in the Southeast at the close of the football season. This, of course, pretty much meant the Southeastern Conference. This was after the Southern Conference, which was at one point the dominant conference in college football, or at least size-wise. At one point, the Southern Conference, I think, reached 21, 22, 24 teams. And then early in the 30s, I think 33 to be precise, the Southern Conference broke apart and select schools started the Southeastern Conference. That's, for all of you out there who maybe weren't aware, that's how the Southeastern Conference started. So by the time 39 rolled around, the Southeastern Conference was now the dominant conference. So if you were going to award a football player in the Southeast, well, that's pretty much where you were looking. In the fall of 43, and in the throes of World War II, the club decided to also award an outstanding prep player to be honored alongside that college football player. Now, this is where our story and the history of the TCA begins. For a frame of reference now, remember, the scene in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, especially when it comes to high school football here in the state. A lot of these schools were vocational, like, say, Boys High or Tech High. The Boys High Purple Hurricanes were pretty much the dominant program, as Brad points out here in the Ever Wonder portion of the program. There were a handful of teams that were absolutely dominant, and Tech High, the Smithies, were also on that short list. The games played between the two and some of the other marquee games of the day were played at Ponce de Leon Park. Really, a place that, and again, I'm a major sports historian here, and people forget just how important Ponce de Leon Park was in the early part of the 20th century. In fact, just for another frame of reference, there's only one thing left from Ponce de Leon Park, for those of you who are big-time sports historians out there, or big-time sports fans. Right on East Ponce, across from the old Sears and Roebuck building that they're now turning into lofts and office parks, right across from there is a shopping center with a Home Depot and I think a World Market and a Whole Foods, something like that. Behind that shopping center is a giant magnolia tree with a little plaque in front of it. And that's the famous magnolia tree that sat in center field of Ponce de Leon Park. It's hard to believe that sometimes when people are walking through that parking lot, putting their groceries in the trunks of their cars, they could be standing, well, where Ty Cobb and Shoeless Joe Jackson and Babe Ruth all once stood. But I digress. That is the point of why I bring that up, though, and why Brad brings it up is because at the time, Ponce de Leon Park was the home of the Atlanta Crackers, the Atlanta Black Crackers. And a lot of people forget that the Atlanta Crackers were the New York Yankees of minor league baseball, winning, I think, a third of the pennants in their 70-year history. That's where these high-level, high-marquee high school football games were in those days. In 1942, the Smithies got an invite to play in the second annual Kiwanis Club Milk Bowl game. Oh, the names in the 30s and 40s and 50s. The game for Tech High was important to the players and to the school. The Smithies vowed to win this game for a former teammate, Billy Jones, who was killed in action, of course, during World War II. Now, this was a rematch, by the way, between the two teams who played in the regular season, and in that regular season ball game, Tech fell to Boys High 28-14. This time, Tech High would come away with the improbable 15-7 upset, and Billy Jones, again, whose brother was killed in action just a few days before the matchup, played, as the Atlanta Constitution called it, 60 brilliant minutes. This, in retrospect, was the coming out party for the Touchdown Club of Atlanta's eventual first player of the year, a guy by the name of Gene Chandler. Chandler was described by media sources in those days as a rangy, blonde Hercules. And that's a quote now. He was 6'2", 195, and he played center and linebacker. He was far from a great player in his first game in his junior season. That was the first year that he played football, his junior year of high school, which was that 1942 season. By the end of that junior season, though, he would become a dominant force. By the time his senior season rolled around in 43, he was considered, and this is a direct quote now, the most devastating defensive player observed in Georgia high school circles in many seasons. His linebacking play was described as deadly and savage. And Chandler would lead a Tech High defense that in 43 would post 7 shutouts and limit opponents to just 2.8 points per ball game. He would also anchor an offensive line that would pave the way for 29 points per ball game. That 43 team would finish their regular season at 10-2 and would win the Smithies their second straight and third annual Milk Bowl game, 7-6, against an all-star team, all-state all-star team comprised of the best players from around Atlanta. He was voted the best player in Atlanta by the newspapermen of the day and given the Player of the Year award in front of the Touchdown Club and 100 distinguished guests at the end of the year gala. Chandler would go on to play his college football at the University of Georgia under legendary head coach Wally Butts, but not before fulfilling a 2-year naval commitment. Of course, that was pretty common in those days, as many of you probably already know. By the time he would eventually arrive at UGA, Brad tells us in 1946, and according to an article, Coach Wally Butts told his team, "You better not be standing around when Gene Chandler is on the field. He will make you wish you played your football somewhere else." Turned out to be pretty prophetic because Gene would earn varsity letters in 47, 48, and 49, and he would lead the Bulldogs to 3 straight incredible lines of bowl games: the Sugar, the Gator, and the Orange Bowls, while he was starting at defensive end. He would be named UGA's most valuable lineman in 49. Gene would end up, after his playing days, leading a full life in Decatur, Georgia. He passed away in 2006 at the age of 80. The great Gene Asher, who covered prep sports for the Atlanta Journal, said of Gene, and I quote now, "I've been watching football for 60 years, and without a doubt, he was the finest high school lineman I ever saw." It's here that we'll forever remember the name of Gene Chandler. Chandler, the Touchdown Club of Atlanta's first ever Player of the Year. Coming up next, well, next is exactly that. What's next? A very busy GHSA calendar. All right, very, very big, busy week across the state this week. Golf has wrapped up its region play. Look, I mentioned this in the opener. You've got every spring sport now that is at the very least in its final 2 weeks of the regular season. At least in their final 2 weeks of the regular season, some in their last week, some playing region tournaments or sectional meets, and of course, some of the state tournaments begin this week as well. Okay, let me start over now so we can make sure we get this right. Golf has wrapped up its region play, and sectionals will begin on April 4th, later this week. Track and field holds its sectional meets this week, and will crown its state champions coming up next weekend, as in, arguably 2 weeks from now. May 9th. May 9th is when the girls will crown their state champions. I'll be on the play-by-play down in Albany, and you can see it live on the NFHS network. As for the boys of track and field, their championships will be held at Jefferson on May 16th. I'll also be on the play-by-play of those championships Saturday, May 16th. That'll be in Jefferson. Again, you can see it live on the NFHS network. Now, the GHSA tennis state tournament kicks into high gear, and by the end of this very week, the quarterfinals will be complete. So we're just 2 weeks away from crowning state champions on the hard courts. The GHSA soccer tournament begins early this week. I have become quite the footy fan over the last few years. I'm excited about MLS Atlanta. I've got my own Premier League team that I follow. And I'll tell you something, as I've been able to call soccer and the championships over the last few years, there's nothing like it. There's nothing like these 3-day affairs in one central location where they have the soccer championships. Never fails. We get some dramatic ball games. In fact, I'm not ashamed to say that I have my own personal list of the greatest games that I've ever seen that I've been lucky enough to be on the play-by-play of. And I'll tell you something, 3 or 4 of those games are soccer matches because they've just been that absolutely dramatic. Of course, the soccer state championships will be held on the 14th, 15th, and 16th down at Mercer University in Macon. That a 3-day affair. I'll be on the play-by-play duties on the 14th and 15th. Not sure who's taking over the duties on the 16th because I'll be calling the track and field boys state championships. But if you have never seen the spectacle of the soccer state championships, I really, and maybe you're down in Macon that weekend for some reason, Take it in. I'm telling you, it's absolutely unbelievable. Great, great high energy out of the young people and, of course, the parents that are there as well. And baseball's tournament begins this week, Friday to be precise. We did our baseball preview. a few weeks ago, I got to tell you, in some weird ways, baseball is completely wide open, but it's really only wide open in the respect that you legitimately have in just about every classification 3 or 4 teams that could win the state championship. Now, those 3 or 4 teams are really, really dominant, but still, just the same, you've got 3 or 4 teams in just about every classification that could win the baseball state championships. And finally, lacrosse finishes its regular season on Saturday, and they'll begin their state tournament coming up accordingly in the following week. Okay, coming up next in the My Take portion of our program, one of the great athletes across the country, a Savannah native, is now, recruiting-wise, up for grabs. Well, there is no lacking in drama when it comes to one Demetris Robertson. Demetris Robertson, if you recognize the name, he's a kid that, well, quite frankly, has gained a lot of mileage as far as publicity goes inside the Georgia high school athletics scene. A kid that I've talked about here numerous times on the TCA All Sports Report. He was the subject of that transferring controversy last year. Wanted to transfer from one private school to another in the city of Savannah. They had to change some rules around, not to allow him to transfer, but they did end up changing some rules in the GHSA's Spring Executive Committee meeting. And of course, this was a major motivator for changing those rules. But that's a side story to the reason I bring up Mr. Robertson. He is, without question, one of the top athletes on the gridiron in the country for 2016. He just this week decommitted from the University of Alabama. Now, he's had a year-long commitment to Alabama. Why the decommitment? No one truly knows. He is a kid who doesn't mind talking. He's a little gregarious, but not, and I don't mean that, I shouldn't even brought that up. I don't mean that he's, he's not Michael Irvin, okay? That doesn't mean that he's a trouble kid. I just mean that he likes to talk, and he'll tell people what he's thinking and why he's thinking it. But mum is the word as far as why he is decommitted from the University of Alabama. Now, why is this big for those of you watching out there for the local flair? Because Georgia has a real shot of landing this kid. Many people believe that the reason Georgia has a big shot and the reason he decommitted from Alabama is because of the time he spent at the University of Georgia in Athens recently, visiting the campus, going to the dog nights, going to the junior days that Mark Richt puts together, and likes the opportunity. Here's what's big for me, because I'm always looking at depth on a team, because remember, these kids going from senior year in Georgia high school football to freshman year at the college ranks, now more than ever, these kids can play in making that leap, especially Georgia kids, California kids, Florida, Texas, and other select states, but especially in the state of Georgia, even going into the SEC. Demetris is that kind of kid. So what's important to me is the depth at the potential position that kid is going to try and occupy. He can play multiple positions. He can punt return. He can play in the secondary. He can be a wide receiver. Shoot, he's even played some running back and quarterback while at Savannah Christian. But he projects most likely as a wide receiver at the next level. And if Georgia is a potential destination, and a lot of dog fans are watching out there, shoot, you don't even have to be a Dogs fan to know the story of the Georgia wide receiver core. One reason Mark Richt was going after a lot of wide receivers for 2015 and is continuing to do so for 2016 because of the injuries to some of the key players on the Georgia Bulldogs staff. The wide receivers, we all know it's not very deep, wasn't very deep last year, not going to be deep this year, already have a significant injury in the wide receiver core for the Bulldogs. So because of that, in 15, as I mentioned, they leaned heavy on wide receivers, and they're going to do the same thing in 16. Tay Crowder, 6'3", 220. Absolute beast. And this kid has sprouted up and put on a ton of muscle over the last, Well, starting with his junior year in high school, the fact that he's 6'3", 220, when I saw him as a sophomore, I can't even tell you how big he was, but I'm amazed that he's sprouted up that big. He's a 15 kid. He's already there on campus. Jason Stanley from Creekside High School, who had an amazing Junior Bowl, Rising Seniors Junior Bowl, won a state championship as a junior. He's there as well. Michael Chigbu out of New Orleans is also there. So they landed 3 top-flight wide receivers, did Mark Richt and the Georgia Bulldogs, for 2015. But they were looking for 2 more, is the word on the streets. And they're looking for 3 for 2016. Don't have anybody verbally committed. So, does that spell Demetrius Robertson saying to himself, you know what, if I can get on campus at the University of Georgia, I can play in the SEC, I can get that high-level experience, I can play for a potential champion in a couple of years? Possibly. Absolutely. Expect to see Demetrius spit out a top 10 or top 5 sometime at the beginning of the football season this year. That's what sources are telling me. Expect to see a top 5 out of Demetrius at some point in August. And furthermore, expect the Georgia Bulldogs to absolutely be in the top 2. Coming up next week, we're dominated by playoffs. The first week of May, or I guess by the time we see each other next, it'll be the second week of May, is a wild and woolly time in Georgia high school athletics. We hope you join us next week right here on the TCA All Sports Report.